Hey y'all, welcome to today's lecture. I gotta tell you, this is like take 87 for me. I do not know why I'm having so much trouble recording today, but I definitely am. Hopefully you all were a little bit more capable of finishing your work because your intersectionality article review is due on Tuesday or today, depending on when you're listening to this. Hopefully you've had time to turn that in. If any of you struggled to complete that assignment or you're still working on it, that's okay. If you think you're going to be long delayed turning that in, I would encourage you to just shoot me a quick message and let me know to expect it. But otherwise, if I don't have it now, I will keep an eye out for it in the next few days. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about queer men, homosexuality, and masculinity. And we're talking about this for a few reasons. One of which is simply that it's a really interesting history, and I say that I'm a little biased because I am a historian of sexuality. Those of you who have taken multiple classes with me know that this is very much in my kind of historical wheelhouse, and so I hope you get sort of as interested in the topic as I am. But the second one is that it is intensely relevant to what we've been talking about for about the last week and a half in this class, as we've talked about sort of turn of the 20th century anxieties about masculinity. As we've mentioned in this class for the last 3 class periods or so, historians have often described the period between about 1880 and maybe 1920 or 30 as being a really pivotal period in the history of masculinity because it's a period when people perceived that masculinity was in crisis. People believed that American men were in danger of becoming feminized, of losing their vitality and their virility and their ability to reproduce. And we've talked about a number of reasons why this was, from changing employment to women's push to have access to the public sphere to the closing of the frontier. But another thing we have to recognize as being a really important backdrop to these developments is the emergence of homosexuality as an identity category in the late 19th century. And I'll explain what I mean by that more in just a minute, because I realize that might seem like an odd statement. But for now, let me just say that what we're going to be talking about in this lecture is very much related to what we've been talking about in the last couple weeks, because one of the reasons that people were really worried about sort of the future of American masculinity is that people were becoming aware for, I won't say the first time, but certainly in a much more intense way than they had been before, that there were not only people who were engaging in sex with people of the same sex, but also people who were starting to form sort of urban subcultures around this practice and actually to embrace homosexuality as an identity, as something that defined them rather than as something they just did. And so that awareness of homosexuality as an identity category is going to create a lot of anxieties. And those anxieties are going to be centered around feminization, but they're also going to be centered around the kind of fear that not only does men being effeminate mean that men might be weak or that they might be overly emotional and incapable of handling the sort of realities of the world, but it also means that men might be engaging in deviant sexual practices. And we could see this if we look back at that kind of rhetoric of Theodore Roosevelt that we discussed last week, where people were saying, oh, Roosevelt is so aristocratic, right? He wears kid gloves. But they didn't just say, oh, he's kind of this foppish, effeminate, effete elite. What they also said was he's given to sucking the knob of an ivory cane. And so even as people are afraid about kind of femininity in men, they're also specifically becoming afraid that femininity in men indicates a kind of sexual perversion or predilection for members of the same sex, which of course was, looked down upon during this period by many people, certainly by many people in the sort of medical professions and in the middle classes. And so the rising awareness of homosexuality is going to create some new anxieties around masculinity, that not only are men becoming effeminate, but they're also becoming sort of sexually depraved to the point that they are going to be incapable of reproducing the species. So, let me explain, as we sort of transition into the body of the lecture now, something I just told you, which is that historians have often argued, and not just historians, gender theorists, etc., have often argued that the late 19th century, specifically the period after about 1860, but especially by the 1880s and 90s, is the period where homosexuality and the homosexual emerge as a distinct identity category. And I realize that this might sound like an unusual statement, because probably some of you are thinking right now, well, wait a second, pretty sure there were gay people before 1880. And in a sense, you're right. Certainly we have a long documented human history of men having sex with other men and women having sex with other women. We can think of some very famous examples. For instance, we know that in ancient Greece, it was very common for older men to have arrangements with younger men that were enduring sexual arrangements, or at least enduring for a time. We know that people got in legal trouble for this kind of behavior in sort of early modern England and in the early United States. If you're curious, sodomy, which was defined as sort of anything but kind of vaginal intercourse, but also sex between men, or sex between women in some cases as well, although that was less common, actually became a crime under Henry VIII. And if you're curious as to why that particular timing, why did Henry VIII make sodomy a capital crime, actually, it had a lot to do with his attacks on the Catholic Church. So Henry VIII was looking for reasons not only to kind of use allegations of sexual impropriety to crack down on Catholic clerics, but also to justify seizing their property, because if you were executed for a capital crime in early modern England, it gave the state the right to seize your estate, essentially. And so this started as a way of kind of penalizing the Catholic Church. But we certainly have a lot of documented instances in which men were prosecuted for this, including a large number of men for having sex with other men. And so we know that the conduct that we associate with homosexuality has been going on for a really long time in human history. And we also know, just as a little bit of an aside, that there were even people at the time who seemed to regard this conduct as indicating something about them. So for instance, I don't know how many of you have been watching the HBO series Gentleman Jack. It was pretty popular last year when it came out. I think it was last year. But it focuses on this woman, and she's pictured here, named Anne Lister. And Anne Lister was a landholder, a fairly wealthy one, in England, in Yorkshire. And among other things, she was very famous for keeping a really extended diary, and I'm talking millions of words. She was a prolific diarist, but she wrote much of this diary in code, and this code was later broken. And what we discovered, and we being historians, right, when they broke this code, was that Anne Lister actually documented a number of affairs with other women in really explicit terms. And what she wrote was not just that she sort of engaged in sex with women, although she did, but she wrote that she loved and only loved the fairer sex. And she seemed to have some sense that this made her unique, that this was more than just a series of actions on her part, that it really spoke to some kind of interior identity that she had that differentiated her from other people. And so, as far as we can tell, we don't really know how common this was, but I do just want to give you a little kind of counterexample to what I'm about to tell you about the sort of argument that homosexuality was a product of the late 19th century. We do have some evidence that there were people before that who regarded themselves as having some special identity on the basis of their same-sex attractions. However, the reason that a lot of historians have argued that homosexuality as we think about it didn't really exist prior to the late 19th century is that people had a really different way of understanding the behavior between, or sort of understanding the relationship between sexual actions and sexual identity than we do. Nowadays, and maybe I shouldn't press this point too far because I think there's still a diversity of opinion on this matter, but we tend to assume that if a man has sex with another man, he might be gay or bisexual or in some way queer. But that's not how people in the sort of early modern period often thought about same-sex sexual contact. Their way of understanding this contact was to think of it in many cases as sinful, right? But not necessarily indicative of your broader desires in any way. So for instance, if a man had sex with another man, he definitely had an unhealthy amount of lust. He was doing something that was unnatural and that was sinful and that might merit punishment. But there wasn't necessarily any belief that that indicated some kind of deeper pattern of desire or some kind of homosexual identity in that man, right? So it's an action-based way of understanding sexual activity and not really an identity-based one like the way we have now. Although, and again, I'm here to provide you with some counterexamples, we do have a recently discovered counterexample to this. And this is fascinating. It's actually just broke in the news about a month ago. But there is a diary that was recently discovered in England, and this diary was written by a farmer, actually also in Yorkshire, so not too far from where Anne Lister lived. And this farmer, who was an everyday guy, not an academic, not a scientist, not somebody who's sort of deeply connected to Parisian salon culture or to the intelligentsia of his day, wrote in this diary that he kept about an execution that was about to happen. There were two men in Yorkshire who were about to be hanged for sodomy, for engaging in sex with each other, because it was still a capital crime at this point. And Tomlinson essentially wrote that he didn't know if he agreed with the justness of that sentence because it seemed odd that men should be penalized for God-given natures. So I'll read you this quote from Tomlinson. He wrote, quote, "It must seem strange indeed that God Almighty should make a being with such a nature, or such a defect in nature, and at the same time make a decree that if that being whom he had formed had at any time followed the dictates of that nature with which he was formed, he should be punished with death." And so what Tomlinson is essentially saying there is, well, it seems to me that some of the men who want to do this with other men are given this nature by God. Not all of them, and he was actually careful to say this. He said, I think some people who do this are just sinful. They're overly lustful. They're just looking for any sexual outlet, any port in a storm. But he said, well, other people, it seems to me, seem to have this as an inclination. And if they have it as an inclination, and they have it from the time that they're very young, it seems to me that God must have given them that inclination. And if God has given them that inclination, or that defect, not all positive here, right? Then it's kind of wrong that we would punish people for following through on the nature that God gave them. And so this is somebody, again, a common person in 1810 who seems to be realizing that some men seem to, from a very young age, be predisposed to seeking out sexual contact or being attracted to other men. And so, it does seem like it might be possible that there are people prior to the late 19th century who are recognizing something that's kind of like how we now think about homosexuality. And again, we don't know how common this was. This is a rare example. Historians are dependent on existing sources, but there's some intriguing work to be done on this right now. But in the meantime, I will present you with the kind of classical, historical, and theoretical interpretation of this that, among other things, is most associated with the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault wrote a multi-volume work called The History of Sexuality, and Foucault is one of the people who argued, essentially, one of the first people who argued that homosexuality emerged in the late 19th century as medical men, as scientists, as alienists, or people we would now talk about as the precursors to psychologists, became aware of and fixated on sex between men, and started to believe that those sexual actions implied a deeper thing about the character of the men who participated in them. So I'll read you a quote from Foucault on this point. Foucault wrote, "Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from a practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphroditism of the soul. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species." And so what Foucault means there is he's referring to a transition from the older model I just told you about to a newer model of identity. So the sodomite was an aberration, right? It might be possible for anybody who had sort of unconstrained lust to seek out a same-sex partner for sex. But under this new kind of regime or way of thinking, that wasn't normal behavior. So a man who wanted to have sex with another man or a woman who wanted to have sex with another woman was not just an everyday sinner. They were unique in some way. And specifically, they were unique in the sense that by the thinking of the late 19th and early 20th century, they had a kind of interior hermaphrodism, that they were inverts or members of the third sex. And this is a little bit different than the way that I think that we often think about sexuality. So, and I'm going to skip ahead in my slides here a little bit. If you've ever gone to a kind of workshop where they explained the difference between things like sex, gender, sexuality, attraction, chances are you might have been presented with something like our genderbread person here. And what this genderbread person is trying to do is help us with terms, right? So on one hand, you have this concept of gender identity. How do you identify? Or masculine, feminine, manness, womanness. Then you have gender expression, right? So it's possible that not everybody feels comfortable actually expressing themselves the way that they identify, but what is your expression like, right? And then there's your quote-unquote biological sex, your maleness or your femaleness that might not be the same as your gender. And then, separately from that, we have the concept of sexuality, right? And so you might have, we think about sexuality as being who you're sexually attracted to and who you're romantically attracted to, but we don't necessarily think of these things as being related to your gender identity. So, for instance, you could be a sort of masculine expressing woman and be romantically attracted to either men or women, right? And similarly, you can be a gay man without necessarily being a feminine man, right? Your gayness doesn't say anything about your gender expression because the two are not necessarily related. Who you are attracted to and what gender you consider yourself or your gender expression has no relationship to each other, right? So this is our modern conception of the relationship between sexuality and gender. There is no relationship. And yet, if we think about the late 19th and early 20th century, that is very much not how people understood homosexuality. People tended to understand homosexuality as being related to gender identity and specifically as a form of gender inversion. So when we look at the discourses that medical men and men of science promoted at this time about who was queer or what made a person a homosexual, they often highlighted a kind of interior hermaphrodism or androgyny. In other words, there was an assumption among these men that what made someone queer was that they had a kind of feminine soul in a male body or masculine soul in a female body, and that's what sort of defined and accounted for homosexuality. There was always I shouldn't say always, but most of the time in homosexuality, some element of gender inversion in somebody's behavior beyond just sexual behavior. So a man who was effeminate or enjoyed wearing women's clothing was thought to be kind of a prototypical or stereotypical homosexual, whereas a woman who was masculine and liked wearing men's clothing would be the stereotypical female homosexual, right? There was assumed to be some kind of interior androgyny. And scientists and medical men who defined homosexuality this way were not just kind of pulling these definitions from thin air. The historian George Chauncey, who wrote a very famous book called Gay New York, argued really that medical men and others who were trying to define homosexuality in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were actually trying to describe, imperfectly and incorrectly in many cases, what they happened to be seeing already going on in sort of gay communities. So whereas Foucault kind of highlighted that homosexuality was this discourse or discursive formation that was created by medical men, by psychologists, etc., and almost kind of imposed on people, Chauncey would say, no, people were already sort of embracing particular kinds of identity categories at the sort of grassroots level, and then medical men and scientists who observed these tried to come in and describe and define them. And part of the reason I think Chauncey argues these medical men focused so much on gender inversion as the defining characteristic of homosexuality is that in many cases, the sort of most visible members of urban queer communities that were forming in a lot of cities at this point were people who identified as fairies, if they were white, or sometimes as faggots, particularly among the African American community. That tended to be a little bit more common of a term. But fairies in sort of urban queer cultures were people who were, in many cases, somewhat gender inverts in their performance. They would be people who might wear women's clothes. And so, for instance, this is Loop de Loop, who was a fairy-identified sex worker in the early 20th century. They might wear women's clothes. They might wear makeup. They might adopt kind of swishy mannerisms. And they often took on the exclusively passive, quote-unquote, role in sex acts. So they would be the partner who got penetrated rather than the partner who did the penetrating. And that was assumed to be the feminine role in sex. And so they would take the, quote-unquote, feminine role in sexual activity. And fairies, because they tended to be different enough in their gender performance to be very visibly quote-unquote abnormal, tended to be the subsection of the queer population that garnered the most notice from people. And so I'll give you just, this is sort of an amusing little aside, but my own research into prostitution in Baltimore led me to read the report of the Maryland Vice Commission, which was this progressive era committee that was supposed to investigate sexual vice in Baltimore and areas around Maryland. And among other things, they started to take notice of the fact that in Baltimore, there were sort of same-sex prostitutes working on the streets. And there did appear to be these established communities of men who had sex with other men and who regarded themselves as queer or homosexual. And they wrote, and you can kind of see the insistence here that gay men were sort of fundamentally different than other men in their gender identities, etc. They wrote, quote, "As a rule, men of this type are distinct from the normal individual," by which they mean heterosexuals, essentially, although that is not a term that really existed. The term homosexual predates the term heterosexual. So they're distinct from the normal individual and can be easily recognized on the street. Their peculiarities are feminine mannerisms, as shown in the gait and in the movement of head and hands, in the rather high-pitched voice, simulating a woman's, and in the choice of words, such expressions as "how charming," "most enchanting," "gorgeously delicious," and "oh my dear" are frequently used. They are strikingly verbose, and nearly always speak in superlatives. Side note, I think we should bring most enchanting back. I think we're not using that enough. And they went on, right? They are much addicted to letter writing. How genteel of them. And their epistles are long and are filled with various veiled references to their practices. Gasp. They nearly always address each other by a girl's name and begin their letters with "My dearest Madge," "My dearest Gladys," or "My darling Phyllis." Many of these fellows are designated by the names of well-known women. For instance, one is known as Maggie Pepper, another as Grace LaRue, another as Lillian Russell. In their rooms, particularly when several of them are together, they put on slippers and wrappers of feminine style and imitate women in other ways. So you can see here this assumption that homosexuality entails gender inversion, and that specifically it entails a kind of interesting gender inversion, because it's not just, and I think you can get this from looking at this, it's not just that gay men are sort of, I don't know how to put this, imitating women. They're imitating a particular kind of very campy and over-the-top femininity, right? This exaggerated kind of campy, very campy femininity. And so fairies in many cases, and we know this from our studies of urban gay history, tended to pluck their eyebrows, adopt kind of an intentionally swishing walk that distinguished them from other men, and often they wore some articles of women's clothing or brightly colored accessories that at the time would be considered too flashy for a quote-unquote normal man. So, for instance, during an era in the early 20th century when it was very common for most native-born and Western European men to wear very drab colors, one of the things that gay men and fairies in particular who were living in cities did to signal their sexual availability was they would wear a red or a green tie. And this was considered too flashy, essentially, for a quote-unquote normal guy. And so it would signal to people that they were kind of sexually available. And this, by the way, would be a little bit of an issue when Italian and Puerto Rican and Latin American men started immigrating to the U.S. in larger numbers and coming to cities like New York, because they brought with them fashions that seemed sort of very unfamiliar to a lot of Americans, including sort of magenta and bright green shirts, bolder patterns, and a lot of people at the time regarded this as sort of almost sexually suspect and a little bit of questionably effeminate at the time. And this link between fairies and sort of gender inversion and homosexuality was so commonly known, it had filtered down so much from the medical discourse to average people, that we can actually see it reflected in some sort of comics or cartoons that were published in newspapers at the time. So, for instance, George Chauncey's Gay New York gives us a number of examples of the fairy sort of appearing in print and in art at the time. And this one says no difference at the top, and it says club rules for the girls. So this is some kind of girls club, maybe like a YWCA type thing. This woman at the desk is saying to the fairy, this is a women's hotel, essentially. And the fairy is saying, well, so what? And the implication here is kind of obvious. And you note that the fairy is also portrayed as dressed in such a way that he appears very feminine, right? His jacket really accentuates the curve of his hips. He's standing with his hand on his hip in a posture that we would typically consider feminized. He's got a handkerchief, presumably kind of brightly colored, sticking out from his pocket. His pants flare at the bottom, almost like a women's skirt, and he's wearing shoes with a really defined heel on them. And very similar joke here, right? All at sea, and this is clearly, people on a sinking ship that are trying to get onto a lifeboat, and we have our fairy here who's, again, in a very effeminate pose, trying to get on the lifeboat, and the officer is saying to him, hey, you, women first, and the fairy says, well, right? So, same joke as the first time. And then finally here again we have a joke about sort of bathrooms, which is something we obviously still argue about in our society, but it says swish right at the top, and the woman who's watching this man go into the ladies' room is saying, "Oh, isn't there some mistake, right? You shouldn't be in there." And the fairy says you, right? And so the joke here is very obvious. Fairies, queer men think that they are women. They identify as women. And this notion, this link between homosexuality and gender inversion to the point that they almost become synonymous, gives us a sense of why people became so anxious about sort of men becoming feminized during this period. Because if men are feminized, that might also mean that they are homosexuals, that they are gay. And that obviously adds a kind of new dimension of anxiety to existing anxieties that men are starting to lose some of their vitality, their vigor, their masculinity. It also, though, creates unusual sexual possibilities, things that we don't necessarily think about now. But if there is a belief that in order to be a gay or queer man, you have to be a gender invert, that is going to mean that definitions of gay or queer men in the early 20th century are often not the same as the definitions that we have now. And hopefully your Chauncey reading gave you a sense of that, and gave you a sense about how anxieties about masculinity and anxieties about queerness shaped sort of the Navy's investigation into the activities at the Newport YMCA. So that's what I want to talk to you about for the remainder of the class. So I'd like you right now to transition to Zoom. Go ahead and log into our meeting, and we'll chat there about any questions you might have about this lecture and about your reading. Okay, see you there.